Okay, picture this. It's the dead of night, June 5th, 2026. The waters of Taganrog Bay, that's right up in the Sea of Azov, are just completely pitch black. And then out of nowhere, the silence is totally shattered. We're talking the roar of incoming drones, massive explosions, and just walls of fire tearing right through the superstructures of two huge commercial cargo ships. Within hours, 5 men are dead, and a massive geopolitical firestorm is literally ignited. So welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're launching a deep dive investigation into this incredibly deadly maritime incident to figure out what exactly happened out there in those dark waters.
And really, that's the central mystery we're unpacking today. Why on earth were two civilian cargo ships, vessels run by neutral third-party mariners, targeted with such overwhelming and lethal force? Now, right after it happened, we were hit with these starkly conflicting narratives from Moscow and Kiev, classic fog of war, right? But in this explainer, we're not just taking those official lines at face value. No way. We're going to dig into the actual incident logs, the open-source maritime data, and the verified OSINT evidence to untangle exactly what went down that night.
Section 1. Attack in the Azov Sea. A night of fire in Taganrog Bay.
Okay, let's dive into this and look at the minute-by-minute breakdown of how this actually unfolded. So both of these vessels, the MV Natra and the MV Sirkon, they were traveling completely empty. In the maritime industry, they call this sailing in ballast. They were heading north from Turkey, making their way toward the Russian port of Rostov-on-Don to load up on grain. Then, at exactly 45 minutes past midnight, Moscow time, the MV Natra gets struck by a swarm of 4 unmanned aerial vehicles. The crew actually manages to put out the resulting fire, which is incredible, but the ship completely loses propulsion. Then, just over an hour later, at 1:55 a.m., the MV Sirkon gets hit. 4 drone strikes, and they are concentrated right on its superstructure. This time, the fire is just uncontrollable. The crew literally has to abandon ship and lifeboats. Fast forward to 3:04 a.m., and the Taman Maritime Rescue Coordination Center officially logs the event, as passing vessels finally start pulling these survivors out of the water to take them to the port of Yeisk.
Section 2. Who was on board? The human cost.
You know, because behind the clinical timestamps and all the loud geopolitical posturing, we really have to remember the human element that got caught squarely in the crossfire here. The human toll of these highly coordinated strikes was absolutely devastating. On the MV Natra, 2 crew members were killed, and that included the ship's master, Captain Raja Bahadov. Over on the MV Sirkon, 3 crew members lost their lives, including their master, Captain Fuad Orujov. And what's just absolutely crucial to understand here is that every single one of the 26 crew members across both of these ships, they were Azerbaijani nationals. These were completely neutral citizens from a third-party country.
In fact, the Azerbaijan Foreign Ministry released a statement making their position crystal clear. They said, the ships are not state-owned Azerbaijani property, coordinating emergency responses with domestic government agencies and diplomatic missions. Basically, Baku had to scramble. They dispatched embassy officials to Russia to check on the wounded and figure out how to bring their dead home. Think about that. These were 25 regular mariners just working on private commercial shipping contracts who suddenly find themselves as the collateral damage of a war their country isn't even fighting.
Section 3. The conflicting claims. Civilian terror or military logistics.
So almost as soon as the smoke cleared over the Sea of Azov, the battle for the narrative kicked off. Let's look at the Russian position first. The Russian Foreign Ministry immediately went on the offensive. They explicitly named the ships and stated that these attacks on civilian vessels and infrastructure confirm the, and I quote here, terrorist nature of the Kyiv regime. So Moscow's official stance is very firm. They claim this was an unprovoked, deliberate terror campaign targeting unarmed civilian merchant vessels that were just operating in commercial water.
But on the other side of the fence, Ukraine definitely didn't shy away from claiming responsibility. Major Robert Bravdy, he's the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, he actually released the strike footage himself. His statement was pretty blunt. He said, "Good optics, heavy 100-kilogram arguments. Contraband logistics of the occupier must be stopped." So the Ukrainian military's position is that these ships weren't innocent at all. They argued these vessels were actively sustaining Russia's war economy, essentially being used for the quiet theft of Ukrainian grain from occupied ports and for transferring military cargo and fuel.
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute collision of realities we see in modern warfare. On the left, you have a narrative of unprovoked terror against innocent civilian trade. On the right, it's a narrative of legitimate, totally necessary strikes against an occupier's military logistics network. When the official statements are this diametrically opposed, how do we actually find the truth? Well, we have to look at the data. Section 4. The OSI evidence. Searching for truth in the data.
All right. We're going to act as impartial detectives here and pivot over to the open-source maritime intelligence. Because to even begin to understand the Ukrainian justification, you really have to understand this one concept, the shadow fleet. Basically, this is a loose network of aging, obscurely owned vessels that operate completely outside conventional registries. Why? To evade international sanctions and monitoring. After Western sanctions hit Russia, this specific network became a massive, primary instrument for sustaining their war economy, moving commodities under foreign flags of convenience just to bypass traditional scrutiny.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly both the Natra and the Zircon fit the exact physical profile of that shadow fleet. Look at the Natra. It was 37 years old, flying a Belize flag. And the Zircon, a staggering 54 years old. I mean, that is an ancient lifespan for a commercial cargo vessel. It was flying a Patalau flag. Plus, both were managed by Turkish commercial operators. Notably, the Zircon actually used to sail under the Russian flag right up until it re-registered in 2022. So, while they weren't technically on published Western sanctions lists when the attack happened, they were undeniably utilizing the exact same administrative cover that shadow fleet vessels use to operate out there in the gray zones.
And it gets deeper, because the Ukrainian military alleged that these specific ships weren't just passively registered in these gray zones, they were actively using evasion tactics. Commander Bravdi claimed that these vessels were deliberately disabling their onboard AIS tracking radars. He even alleged they were physically painting over their hull identification markings. According to Kyiv, these are the exact steps taken by vessels that are intending to quietly transport contraband, stolen grain, and military fuel totally undetected through occupied waters. But let's look at the actual OSINT analysis of the strikes themselves, because the visual evidence shows this incredibly clinical precision. These drones, they didn't just hit the ships randomly. No, they targeted the bridges and the superstructures head-on. The attacks were timed perfectly around the midnight watch exchange. The objective here clearly wasn't to sink these massive steel hulls, which by the way were left largely intact, but to completely destroy the vessel's command and control centers. It was a highly targeted decapitation of the ship's ability to navigate and operate.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, the new maritime reality, the blurring lines in the Black Sea.
So what does this highly specific, localized incident actually mean for global shipping? Well, we can look directly at the U.S. Maritime Administration, or MARAD. In their official advisory for this region, they explicitly issue this warning. The potential remains for miscalculation or misidentification resulting in a high risk of damage to commercial vessels. Essentially, the lines between military logistics and commercial civilian trade have completely dissolved in the Sea of Azov. For everyday commercial sailors, these waters are no longer just a regular trade route. They become an active, lethal, and incredibly unpredictable combat zone.
So, the crucial point is that it all boils down to a single number, 5. Whatever the geopolitical realities of the shadow fleet might be, whatever the military justifications coming from Kyiv or the accusations of terror from Moscow, the objective, completely verified outcome of this incident is that 5 neutral, third-country sailors went to work on a routine commercial contract and they were killed in a single night.
Which leaves us with this final, honestly very dark reality to consider. As this shadow fleet inevitably dissolves the distinction between commercial and military space, who actually protects the civilian mariner caught in the crossfire? When the registry of a vessel makes it a military target, but the crew on board are literally just innocent civilians trying to make a living, whose responsibility is their safety? It's a question that currently has absolutely no answer. And as the conflict in the Azov continues, it's a danger that is only going to grow. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep looking for the truth in the data.